church, and welcome to another midweek update from your pastor. I'm standing here today on Brown Boulevard on a piece of property that our church actually purchased 38 years ago. And so we have been invested in ministry right here in this part of Arlington for many, many years. And behind me are a number of people who've had life investment and life connections here to this piece of property. And I'm grateful that they could all join me today for this very significant occasion. It was back in 1987 when this building was actually built, and Dr. Wade was our pastor here then, and it was April of 1987. He, along with some other folks, dedicated this building, and we planted a church here. And that church was known as Grace Baptist Church, and it continued to share the gospel and had a gospel witness on this piece of property for a number of years. But over time, things changed, and leadership of that church changed. But about 14 years ago or so, we reclaimed this property as members of First Baptist Arlington. We continued to own it, and so we reclaimed the responsibility for it. And in those days, what was located here was a small church that was fledgling, in all honesty, and had some financial challenges and leadership challenges. And so we as a church, we reclaimed this piece of property and this ministry at First Baptist Arlington. And when we did that, we realized that we had our work cut out for us. And so we had several folks who, from our church, volunteered their time and their energy and their resources to help us replant this church, if you will, and gain a new vision. In fact, some of those people are right here behind me today who invested their lives here. We called Todd Steele to be the interim pastor of this church. Todd was a professor at that time at Truett Seminary. He's now dean of Truett Seminary. And I was an adjunct professor at Truett in those days. And so Todd and I were partners in ministry, and he and his wife Carolyn used to be members of our church years ago, and so he had a heart for ministry in this community, and so he served as the interim pastor of the church that we were replanting and reestablishing. And in the fall of 2007, I had a young man in my class named Clint Dobson, and Clint was a tall, striking young man, and he was a very good communicator. He was full of life, I would say full of mischief in some ways, and had a great sense of humor and was a very passionate young man, and I just fell in love with him in my class. And so we were at the point where we were beginning to really seriously look for someone to come and actually serve as the pastor of this church. And so we prayed about that, and Todd Steele and I actually talked a good bit about it, and we felt led to visit with Clint about his willingness to come and serve as the pastor of North Point Baptist Church, which is the church that would really become the mission church of First Baptist Arlington. Well, Clint at the time was the pastor of the Permela Baptist Church, and which is in a thriving community here in Texas, and he felt led to make his way to Arlington, and then he introduced us to a beautiful young lady who's sitting right behind me here, Laura Roseman, and he and Laura endeared themselves to us. They got married and began their ministry life here together. Clint became a part of our staff, First Baptist Arlington, and he was just very much a part of the life of our church in those days. Clint was an excellent preacher. As I said, he was funny. He was larger than life. In so many ways, there were a lot of things that Clint and I would joke about back in the day. One day I showed up at the office and I had on a pink shirt and a pink tie, and he stopped me and we had this long conversation about whether or not I should be wearing pink and was I man enough to do that. And it wasn't long after that, he showed up at the office one day with a man purse. And so we kind of decided that if I could wear a pink shirt, he could carry a man purse, and all good. So that's one of the reasons I'm wearing a pink shirt today, just as a shout out to the fun we used to have with one another. Clint was a passionate leader. He had a dream. He had a vision for this place, and we talked a lot about it. And one of the dreams that Clint had was that this piece of property, this campus, this building, would be filled with youth and children and young families. And we tried to engage in some ministry at a local school here not too far from us, and That didn't seem to go as well as we'd want, but somehow Clint believed that one day this place would be full of children in this community and youth. And so we talked about that dream, we prayed about it together, and we trusted that somehow God would bring that to fruition. However, 10 years ago today, March the 3rd, 2011, Clint's life tragically ended right here on this property in his office behind me, as his life was taken from him. And to say that was a day filled with grief and shock would be an incredible understatement. Obviously, it was incredibly difficult for Laura and Clint's family and Laura's family. Also, Judy, who happened to work here with Clint, she was beaten unmercifully and senselessly that day and remarkably survived. But it certainly changed her life and her family's life. So the events that happened here on March the 3rd, 2011 shaped every one of us in our futures. But today I want to share a word of encouragement with you today as I reflect on what's happened since then. I brought with me today, I have a bulletin from the last Sunday that Clint served as the pastor of this church. And I want to share with you his sermon that day. The title of it is The Testimony of Martyrs. And his text that day was Acts 12, the first 5 verses. And Clint, of course, had no idea what was facing him that very week. But let me just read that text to you, where Luke says it was about this time that King Herod arrested some who belonged to the church, intending to persecute them. He had James, the brother of John, put to death with the sword. When he saw that this was met with approval among the Jews, he proceeded to seize Peter also. And this happened during the Feast of the Unleavened Bread. After arresting him, he put him in prison, handing him over to be guarded by 4 squads of soldiers, 4 each. Herod intended to bring him out for public trial after the Passover. So Peter was kept in prison, but the church was earnestly praying to God for him. So that was the text of Clint's final sermon. And the title of the message was The Testimony of the Martyrs. Well, you think about that today. The Greek word, martyr, is translated into English in the New Testament as witness. And obviously we get our English word martyr from that Greek word. Those witnesses in the New Testament, many of them lost their lives. In fact, this text is about one of those, John, who would lose his life. And then ultimately later we know that Simon Peter would join him. And they would be known not only as witnesses, but as martyrs. Stephen is referred to as a martyr in Acts 22, verse 20 in the New Testament. Well, there was a church father named Tertullian. And Tertullian was watching how the church was being persecuted. And he noticed something, that whenever the church was persecuted, somehow miraculously the church began to grow. And it led him to make that famous statement, the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. And that was a prophetic word from Tertullian, because there have been many who've given their lives for the gospel. And yet, even though when that happens, somehow miraculously, God is able to redeem that sacrifice. And historically, the church has continued to thrive all across the world. So today we're standing on holy ground for a number of reasons. As I said, some 38 years ago, our church bought this property and declared it to be holy ground. And there has been a gospel witness on this property for so many years. It's holy ground. But it's also a place where Clint Dobson was martyred for doing what he loved to do, proclaim and live the gospel and engage in ministry. So it's holy ground for sure because of that. It continues to be holy ground today. Well, I want to just share a quick word about the testimony of the martyrs. When I think about that, a couple things come to mind to me. One of them is when you think about the martyrs in the faith, one of the things that I think comes to my mind is this, that it demonstrates that there's something worth believing in. Martyrs prove that. There's something worth believing in. Well, that's something for us, for Clint, for those of us who are right here today, for our church, for the church that's located on this property. That something is the gospel. And actually, we believe the gospel is worth believing in. In fact, we believe the gospel is true. We believe it's life-changing. At Clint's funeral, I said that the gospel is sturdy enough for this day. And I meant it that day. It's sturdy enough for every day. It's been sturdy enough to get people who have struggled with their grief and the challenges that come our way, particularly when brought upon by our lives by circumstances beyond our control, like what happened here 10 years ago. But the gospel is sturdy, y'all. It is sturdy enough for this, and it's worth believing in. Martyrs also prove to us that there's something worth dying for, and that also is the gospel. Stephen is the very first one who died for the gospel's sake, and he's referred to as a martyr in Acts 22, verse 20. But John the Apostle would die because of his belief in the gospel. So would Simon Peter. So would St. Paul. And the list goes on. And ultimately it comes all the way right here to Arlington. So would Clint Dobson. Because the gospel is worth dying for. It's that meaningful. We believe it's that true. We believe it's that powerful. We believe it's that life-giving. And it is worthy of offering our lives for it. But I'd say one other thing about it. While all these kids are running by. One other thing I'd say about the gospel. When martyrs prove to us that there are some things that are just worth living for. And that's what I'd say about the gospel. The gospel is worthy of our life. It's worth living for. And so people give their lives to the gospel because it really is life-giving. I would tell you this, Clint Dobson lived well, and he lived for the gospel. He didn't just die for the gospel, he did that. But way before that ever happened, he lived for the gospel. And that's the encouragement for me and you. And here's what I want you to know. The gospel's life-giving. As I said, think about Clint's vision for this piece of property. He wanted to be filled with children and youth and young families. Well, how fitting is it that while we're standing here shooting a video, little kids are running by us? And you know why? Because this place is filled with children. Because the gospel brings life, and that dream has come true. There's a church planted here. And that church is led by two of Clint's colleagues, Kevin Rowe and David Bonet, fellow students at Truett Seminary. Kevin's right here with us today. And so the church that's here is providing life and witness and giving a testimony to this community about the beauty of the gospel. But there's also a school here. And this school is filled with children every single day. And so you know what that means? That means this place is filled with life. Well, that's what the gospel brings. And Clint's legacy lives on. It's not just here. His legacy lives on here, but his legacy lives on at Baylor. Clint loved Baylor. He loved Truett Seminary. And there's a scholarship at Truett Seminary established in Clint's honor and celebrates his memory. And every semester, there are students who benefit from that scholarship, and they're able to stay engaged in their life pursuit because Clint's family and friends have provided that resource so that there will be students just like him who can train for this very same gospel, and they can give their lives to it and proclaim the truth of it just like he did so well. So in spite of the tragedy, in spite of the loss and the grief and the shock that we've all felt, there's also joy in our hearts today because we've seen the life that God has given to us. We've seen the life that has come from Clint's legacy, and we continue to see it paying rich dividends in the lives of so many. Only in heaven will we be able to measure the impact and the breadth and the width, if you will, of Clint Dobson's ministry. So today, 10 years after his death, we want to give him honor, and we want to say thank you, Clint, for a life well lived. But we want to do what he would do. We would want to point you all to the gospel so that you know this gospel gives life to all of us. And because of that, our hearts are actually filled with joy as well today. So wherever you may be in your life, whatever may be happening to you right now, you might be in a very tragic, difficult, shocking situation. I want to encourage you. Those situations for us are temporary. There's life on the other side of them, and this is living proof that that's exactly the truth. So God bless you. Thank you for joining us today, and I trust that God will continue to encourage you and bless you as you find ways to live out the gospel in your own life.